a very good morning to you. We're live in London. You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Coming up today, here at Midori House in London, my guests Tina Fordham and Stephen Dalziel share their views on the week's biggest stories. Tina, good morning. What have you spotted?
Good morning. Well, as a political analyst, I'm always reading the news. So the question is more, what's interesting about the news? I think the announcement last night about national service was an interesting one. It wasn't on my list, but Stephen and I corresponded about it.
Thank you. And Stephen, what have you spotted? You spotted the national service thing as well, didn't you?
I did spot the national service, and there's a tenuous link that one could make with the war in Ukraine. And indeed, my top story of the week has been more arrests amongst senior military officers in the Russian armed forces as Putin becomes ever more Stalin-like.
Thank you for that. Looking forward to it. We'll also head to Nairobi for the latest.
This is Monocle's correspondent in Nairobi. I will be looking at the significance of Kenya's 4-day state visit to the United States. And we will find out whether lions are really hunting at night in the suburbs of Nairobi.
Plus, we'll be checking in with our editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, who'll be talking to us about food allergies in Tokyo. It's the 26th of May, 2024, live from London. This is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
And a very warm welcome to Tina Fordham and Stephen Dalziel. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Dragging yourselves in on a really wet Sunday morning.
Pleasure to be here.
I think we all know what wet London looks like nowadays from what we saw on... What day did that happen? Was it Wednesday when
It was
Rishi
Thursday.
Sunak...
Drowning Street.
Thursday,
Drowning
Street. It was amazing as those puddles formed on the poor man's suit.
You just wondered what they were thinking. I mean, clearly they thought it wouldn't be manly or powerful to do anything as pragmatic as hold an umbrella whilst making an announcement of a general election that no one was expecting. But the whole visual was surreal.
But
it was soaked.
There was a prediction for it. Yesterday, as I tend to do, just happened to be listening to some Beatles songs. And in the song Penny Lane, there's the line, and the banker never wears a Mac in the pouring rain.
No.
Very strange.
Of course. Yes. It was very, very strange. And speaking to someone who was very, very close to the Prime Minister physically at the time that it happened with, I have my contacts, you know, there was a general consensus by the press corps that someone just wanted to go and give the poor man an umbrella. That actually all, you know, the sort of the political fighting and the posturing and this, that and the other was all put aside, that there was a very human need to protect someone who clearly was either unable or had been briefed not to talk about it or anything. And what the briefing questions is like, why was he allowed to go outside in the pouring rain without an umbrella or a Mac or even reference it?
Well, why didn't he act normal and say, oh my goodness, it's really coming down, isn't it? That would have been a moment where we would have, you know, he would have elicited our sympathy. It was odd to just carry on as if nothing was happening, and then the trolling with the music being played by the protester.
And it's also, Downing Street does have a big room that everybody can go into. It was, you know, for COVID, the room is there, that he could have done it inside.
Well, I understood that there might be some prohibition against doing that because it's it's state business, and this is a party announcement, and he was speaking as the leader of the Tory party. But I mean, in any case, it just flopped, and the campaign has seemed off to a, inauspicious start.
Did you watch it?
I did. It just struck me that, oh my God, the country has got to such a terrible state now that they can't even afford a large umbrella for the Prime Minister.
I think Rishi Sunak might be able to. I think he'd be all right for umbrellas.
Maybe it's because he's a robot. Maybe this is it, actually. So it didn't matter whether, he's not going to catch a cold or anything because, he's so wooden.
Yes, I thought there was going to be a bucket of hot water and a towel and some hot lemon on the inside when he sort of came in. And the poor man, if he doesn't get some terrible chill from that, I've no idea. Anyway. And you watched it with your son, is that correct?
I watched it with my 16-year-old, and we were falling about laughing. And as an American who's been resident in this country for 22 years, I actually, as much as I don't think it bodes very well for the Conservative Party's re-election prospects, I do think the national response to the whole thing was quite, very British in that everybody was making a joke about it. There isn't this kind of faux sanctimoniousness that we have in the United States and the self-righteousness. Just everybody was in on it. With that in mind, we're definitely not as polarized as the United States. That's one thing we can say. When we've got a very well-developed sense of black humour.
Wonderful. Right. So we've dispatched with the Prime Minister for the moment, at least, although we will come back to one of the policies that's been splashed across the front pages this week. How have your weeks been? Have yours been slightly drier than the Prime Minister?
Mine's been pretty dry because I've been inside a lot of the time because I've been doing a lot of writing and indeed translating. But yesterday, now, let's make it clear to the listeners, it doesn't always rain in this country. It was a glorious sunny day yesterday, at least in the south of England. And my wife and I visited a wonderful garden called the Hillier Gardens near Winchester in Hampshire. And walked for miles, and it was beautiful.
Heavenly. And how about you, Tina? Have you had something similarly bucolic and gorgeous?
Not at all. I'm self-employed, and I have a child doing GCSEs, so that means a lot of being told to bugger off and then to come back again and make supper.
Go away and help me.
Yes, go away and help me. Don't be around. Where are you? And then, carrying on with the business of analysing geopolitics. Last week, it was only a week ago that the Iranian president was killed in a helicopter crash. So I spent a lot of last week covering that and what it means for the Middle East.
I mean, just looking at the way that people approached you, obviously from the international view, to get a take on what the general election is going to be doing here. I mean, because here in the United Kingdom, you sort of feel as if you put on rather a heavy jacket and then you sort of carry it for a few months, a few weeks, the 6 weeks that in the run-up into, as we have purdah, as we are careful with what we are saying, as we have constant campaigning from this bit of a parliamentarian and that bit of a parliamentarian. It is, you go in with a sense of excitement, but also with sort of a sense that you've just been saddled with something. How is the rest of the world viewing the general election? I mean, obviously the visual power of Rishi Sunak getting absolutely drenched is something which will be carried around the world. But what are people thinking about the United Kingdom as it goes into its election?
Well, everyone knows by now that this is one of the biggest years for elections in human history, right? With tens of millions of people going to the vote. So I hate to pour cold water on the idea that people might be asking about UK elections amongst my international financier client base, but they're not really, except for UK investors and clients. And on that front, there is actually more room for optimism than I can remember for some time. And I would echo what Bloomberg wrote about earlier this week, that people in the City of London are ready for some good news and actually think that Labour might be able to deliver it. That's a first in my 22 years in this country.
And the fact that the United Kingdom, I mean, within the context of an enormous election year, would you have thought perhaps in the past that the United Kingdom's election would have commanded a little bit more attention, or is this
pre-Brexit? Yes.
Right.
And that's really what it's about. But there's another reason why there is less worry about UK elections, and that's just the fact that the two parties are so, perceived to be so close together. This isn't a high-stakes election. And when it comes to the UK's role in either global trade or in security, particularly with regard to Ukraine, there isn't a lot of question about continuity on that front. So, that's the real reason.
I saw a very good example, actually, international example this week, because probably my favourite read. I've become very cynical about many newspapers, but my favourite read is the Washington Post. I get the emails daily. I get about 3 or 4 emails daily, which, of course, pick out the main stories in them. So on Thursday and Friday, I concentrated and think, OK, now they must have picked up that we're going to have an election here. The only British story highlighted by the Washington Post on Thursday was that in one of the magazines, I think it was Tatler or something, one of the fancy magazines, there'd been a picture of Kate, the future Queen of Britain, which wasn't terribly flattering. And that was the story they picked out. There wasn't one word about there being...
It was a painting of Kate, yes. So it's not going to generate a lot of coverage, other than as a bit of entertainment, I think. But obviously it matters for us.
Yes. OK, let's have a look at the papers. What have you both spotted this morning? Stephen, would you like to kick off for us?
Well, if I can talk about the one we flagged up at the top of the programme, which is spread across, I think, every single British paper, apart from the lowest of the low, the Daily Star, that this story that the Conservatives have suddenly come up with, excuse me, laughing. I just find the timing incredible that they're going to reintroduce, if they get re-elected, they will reintroduce conscription, which is something that hasn't existed in this country since 1960, and that all 18-year-olds, boys and girls, young men and young women, would either spend a year in the armed forces or once a month spend a weekend doing some sort of community service. Now, in and of itself, this is perhaps not such a bad idea, but it's just the timing is just so pathetic, because this has been talked about for years. When I was a young man, the people used to say, "Oh, you should bring back conscription," particularly the Colonel Bufton Tufton of the extreme right wing and the Conservative Party. And it just seems now to release it at this point, 2 days after an announcement of election, as a desperate attempt to try and get those right-wing Conservatives who might be thinking about voting for the Reform Party, which I can think of as the AFB, the Alternative for Britain, because it's a very right-wing and very unpleasant party with people like Nigel Farage in it. And it just seems to me like a desperate attempt at this stage to grab those right-wing voters by something that is popular with the right wing. There are people across the political spectrum who think, actually, this might not be a bad thing. But has it been thought out? I mean, it's been talked about for years, and suddenly they throw it at us on a Saturday night.
Well, it's not really the way to get the youth vote, is it? But I didn't think they were talking about bringing back conscription as such. It was national service with a weekend a month. I mean, let's not alarm the viewers or those of us with teenage children overly. But I agree. It's about siphoning away reform voters, and definitely not for attracting the youth vote.
Which is it's a difficult balance, isn't it? Because I think you hit the nail on the head, because I think yesterday Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, said we're going to reduce the voting age to 16 or 17, which is a great vote winner for people who are 16 or 17. But to bring this back now, it kind of distracts from the bigger issue, which is whether some form of sort of military service.
Community service is not a bad idea, and in a lot of countries do it really well. And there are some positive byproducts, like engaging young people in the political process and with communities and addressing the loneliness epidemic. One could imagine such a thing. But the way this policy was announced, kind of like the election announcement, really speaks of desperation to me, and reactive, kind of a reactive instinct.
We've already had, I think the Home Secretary James Cleverly has been on air this morning doing the political rounds, saying that military option is selective, but questions have arisen over whether any teenager who refuses to do it will be punished. No criminal sanctions, no one's going to jail over this. No one's going to do it, are they, Stephen?
Well, no, that's the point. And if I wrongly use the term conscription, yes, national service is what it is. But basically, if you're forcing young people to go into the military, it's a type of conscription. But of course, there are countries in Europe, the Scandinavian countries, of which I'm a great admirer, generally as countries and the way they run them. They do have compulsory national service for men and women, and they're talking about putting people into the army for a year, or the armed forces for a year. I did a year in the armed forces. I think I'm still fairly
and I'm
normal.
all right for it. The wider issue in terms of the global relevance to this is slightly different, because you can talk about, how good an idea it would be to have a better sense of community and connectivity and civic duty and et cetera, which, many people would say is applaudable. But to actually have some sort of obligatory military service when we have a hot war on Europe's doorstep, it slightly reframes it, doesn't it?
It certainly raises the stakes that this, that this infrequent training might eventually lead to your son or daughter, jumping out of an airplane over, territory in the former Soviet Union, which will alarm some parents. But it is unfortunate, because, again, I think that we're all agreeing that skill building and training and all kinds of things could have been wrapped up in such a policy, but it was announced and conceived poorly.
And there is for you, Stephen, the looking at what's happened with Russia and Ukraine, to suddenly have the United Kingdom wanting to have some active military involvement by every teenager it's a very, very delicate balance, isn't it?
I think you're putting a very Kremlin spin on it, actually, Emma. I mean, that I can see how it could be portrayed. I haven't seen yet a Russian reaction to it, but I can see that they could say something like that. Let's not get too carried away and say, well, it's definitely because we're going to send troops to Ukraine. Because we do expect the war to go on for a long time. That's sadly true. But I think it's such an unthought through piece, because there's been a lot of complaints in recent years how they've run down the armed forces. I mean, I think a weekend in which we had the FA Cup final today and the Championship playoff today at Wembley, one thing that struck me very strongly for many years is that the size of the army, you could get the whole of the British Army into Wembley Stadium and still have 20,000 empty seats. The British Army is that small now.
And underfunded. The equipment is not terribly good.
So, suddenly you come out with this idea, we'll train youngsters. But it just doesn't, it's just doesn't fit together. The piece is ridiculous. And, if they'd been talking about this for weeks beforehand, then you'd say fine. But it's just so obvious, a desperate attempt for winning votes in the election from
older people.
From the older people,
yes.
And as Tina says, I can't see many young people. I mean, many young people who do, for example, the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme, which teaches people a lot of life skills.
Those of us who haven't done that, what is that, Steve?
It's outward bound. You go camping, you go orienteering, you can go whitewater rafting.
My 16-year-old is doing the Gold. It's actually a fantastic program that I think more kids should do. But it's kind of, I see it as the UK's answer to the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides, really, but more formalised.
And what does it do to an individual? What have you seen happen to your son? I mean, obviously you've mentioned the moment that he's like, go away, help me with his GCSEs.
That's just normal teenage instinct. But no, it's group work, it's planning. They plan all their meals. They have to learn orienteering, as you said. They have to be without their phones, all of these things which we are, now find quite salubrious. But it gets them out of their houses, out of school, and working on projects and being in the outdoors, which we know is generally a good thing. So, again, this policy could do well, but it only polls well with the over 65s, which really makes you wonder what they were thinking.
What I call the IMD brigade, in my day brigade.
Perfect.
Tina, let's move on to something that you've spotted this morning. What's struck you, apart from trying to defend your son against compulsory conscription? I think all three of us are the parents of a son.
Yes.
Who would we're just sort of, you do sort of slightly mentally mind map. You just think, that'd be all right.
Yes. But I've got a 19-year-old daughter who would be caught up in it as well. So I have been, Stephen and I both are, if I may say, old Cold War types. And so when I saw that the Russians had moved some markers in the sea, otherwise known as buoys, in Narva, my ears pricked up, because this kind of moving of the goalposts and is one of the things that triggered the war in Yugoslavia, for example.
Explain to us just broadly what's happened. There's been some removal of Estonian border markers, haven't there?
Yes. Removal of the border markers. That triggers a process, of course, to ask why they've done this. And we've had some very measured rhetoric from the Estonian Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, who is a real superstar leader in Europe. But this is an example of the kind of gray zone tactics that Russia is using all over Europe at the moment. And it points to something that I call stealth geopolitics. It is a way of literally changing the facts on the ground, of causing anxiety and planting the seeds of doubt about Russia's intentions without triggering a military response.
And it's a very practical reason to have these buoys along the middle of the Narva River, isn't it? Because what it does is it stops vessels from straying into the wrong
fishermen.
waters. It's a really simple thing. So once you start to remove the buoys, as Tina says, practically on the ground, if you are skippering a boat or captaining a ship, it suddenly destabilises your view of what's going on, because practically you don't know where you're going.
No, indeed. And then if you do stray onto the wrong side, you risk being arrested. And that stirs up more trouble and more worry, more anxiety. Exactly as Tina was saying, this sadly, for those of us who've, like Tina and I, have looked at Russia for many years, I mean, it's just, there's absolutely no need for this. You know, we wanted Russia back at the end of the Cold War, 89, 91, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev going on to Yeltsin. All the talk was bringing Russia into the fold. Russia, even though it didn't deserve it, was made a member of the G8, that NATO set up the Partnership for Peace to work closely with Russia, then the NATO-Russia Council. You know, all these things that the West has done, and that's what really gets me when Russia denies any of this. But all these that were done from the West to try and bring Russia into the fold. And Putin has constantly moved Russia further out of the fold, and now is so far out of the fold, all he wants to do is cause chaos in Europe, be it by a hot war in Ukraine, or be it by another story which Tina has pointed out to me, in Austria. We may have time to talk about this, the shenanigans with trying to disrupt the political situation in Austria, or be it something that sounds as simple perhaps to the general reader as, just moving a few or removing a few border posts. But the consequences of it can be enormous.
Indeed, and it goes back to the why what Putin is doing sort of principle, the greater intention, which has always been to shore up and to protect one's border and to protect one's Russian identity by pushing into other people's space. Pushing into other people's space and saying we're doing this because we're defending ourselves. One of the saddest changes, I'll put it that way, in what Putin has done, and particularly in the last 2 years since the start of the war in Ukraine, is that we've gone from a position where Russians... I first went to the Soviet Union in 1974, and so I've heard this... I remember hearing it on that occasion. All along, people were saying, as long as there's no more war. That was the message that came out of the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, as the Russians call it, that this was so terrible. 27 million Soviet citizens lost their lives. We must never have this again. Putin has now completely flipped the coin and has made war the new normal. And this is what he's working on particularly, we talked about young people earlier, working on young Russian people, that they are brought up with this idea now that everyone's out to get us. We must, if necessary, strike first. But war is the new normal. The whole economy is now based on a war footing in Russia. And that's a complete 180-degree turn, which is very worrying. Stephen just mentioned this story to do with how... Well, it's a great story in Politico, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a big expose.
Putin has hijacked Austria's spy service. Now he's going after its government. Just explain this story, because it's jaw-dropping, yet at the same time, when you read it, you think, oh, actually, that could happen.
Well, then it has happened. If we go back to the Wirecard story, which was a big corporate fraud scandal, it turns out that the person at the center of that, Jan Marsalek, was a GRU agent asset. And this comes on the back of the Politico story about the infiltration of Wirecard, of the Austrian spy service, the idea that Russia was able to dismantle Austria's spy network and rebuild it again with its own agents at the heart of it.
How did they go about this? Because it is a very, very long read from Politico. It's really worth doing it. But could you just take us through what the Russians actually managed to do practically with inside the Austrian spy service?
The short explanation is they managed to discredit it and have the people at the helm removed and replaced with agents that they had bought. And it shows you how easy, I guess, it is that it can be done. And Austria is a small country without huge influence in the EU. But not only that, the most popular political party in Austria is now a pro-Russian party. And if we add that to Hungary, the Dutch government, which has now just managed to form with Geert Wilders' Freedom Party at the helm, which everyone said couldn't happen, there is it's more than a creeping far-right pro-Russian bent. It's really gaining momentum.
And within Austria itself, I mean, much has been said in the last couple of years about this incredibly ambiguous position that Austria occupies.
Yes, I mean, you could go back and say over the last almost 100 years, Austria's had a rather ambiguous position. Austria didn't exactly shout and scream at the time of the Anschluss in 1938, when effectively Germany took over Austria. Hitler was born in Austria, we should point out as well, perhaps. And since then, in the wake of the Second World War, Austria was known as the spy capital of Europe, and as a legacy of that, Russia has more so-called diplomats working in Austria than in any other country, I think, in the world, certainly in Europe. It's something like 250, many of whom are spies. That's what not only Russia does, but that's what countries do. They staff their embassies with people who want to gather information, shall we say. But I think it's highly significant that Russia has always seen Vienna as something of a target. In the shuffling around after the end of the war, Austria was supposed to be left neutral. It wasn't taken under the Soviet umbrella, such as Poland and Hungary and Romania and the other East European countries. But at the same time, it was never really fully a part of the West. It's not a part of NATO, for example. It's a part of the EU, but it has a relationship with NATO. But I think that's partly from both sides, that I'm not sure that NATO entirely trusts Austria.
And in terms of trade, I think there was an article a couple of weeks ago talking about the amount of business that is still done between the likes of the Austrian bank Raiffeisen and Russia. I think I read somewhere that Raiffeisen's Russian arm has generated more profit in the last 3 years than the entirety of the group's other operations. And this is in a context where the European Union is not supposed to be doing any business at all with Russia. How is that happening? And also, when you're talking to investors and colleagues and what have you, what do they think of Raiffeisen for doing this?
I mean, in the context of the wider financial services, Raiffeisen is not a huge player, it has to be said, but it shows that it's possible to keep these links going. Listen, there are many institutions that believe that one day Russia will be back into the international fold, and they want to preserve their optionality. I mean, I advise against that. I think Russia will never come out from under sanctions in our lifetime for all the reasons that we've just described, because as we speak, they are sowing the seeds of future conflicts. I mean, the Narva location is important also because Narva is where a lot of Russian speakers and Russian citizens live. So it's a strategic location. I remember being at a NATO meeting in Vienna, which I think we all need to go back now and watch The Third Man again with Orson Welles, which takes us back to Vienna's post-war
history. Here's the Spain playing right now.
Yes, the discussion was about, this was 10 years ago, how Russia was ahead of us in the propaganda war. And I think for so many contemporary people, that sounds like it came from The Third Man, like it's from something from the ancient past. And so our antennae aren't attuned to the idea that out from under us in a number of European countries, in addition to Raiffeisen, as you said, Austria has also been dependent upon Russian gas all this time. So it is the equivalent of a geopolitical swing state in a lot of ways. And yet Brussels has to focus on the European parliamentary elections, has to deal with the Middle East. Ireland, for example, having recognized the Palestinian state. We haven't talked about the Middle East yet, and I think Spain did as well. A lot of moving pieces, and Russia is exploiting the gaps.
The destabilizing factor that we speak about so much when we refer to Russia.
Indeed, and thinking of television programs, thinking of The Third Man, there's something, and this may be terribly frustrating if people, I'm not sure if you can get it internationally on BBC iPlayer, but there's a 3-part documentary series on the BBC at the moment called Secrets and Spies, and it looks back to the 1980s, a particularly dangerous period in the Cold War. In fact, we've only in recent years realised just how close we came to nuclear war. And it focuses on 3 spies. The third episode finishes with a follow-on to suggest that they're actually going to bring it up to date and look at Putin's Russia, and you will see, if they do it properly, that there's a direct connection. The circles come round again, as it were. We're in that situation yet again. So, the spies have never gone away. The attempts to disrupt have never gone away, and in fact have only got stronger now.
And how do we deal with a country like Austria, which is, as we've been talking about, and there's been extensive coverage that you've mentioned, is is rather murkily attached to Moscow, because it is within the European Union's bosom. It has, it is not that far from Ukraine. And so, one wonders what happens when an Austrian diplomat walks into a room. Does everyone sort of look at their shoes and think, what the hell do we say to them?
Well, that Austrian diplomat might walk into a room in Brussels where there are plenty of MEPs who are on Moscow's payroll as well. And that is another news story that has been emerging in Lithuania, which is one of the important bulwarks against Moscow. An MEP who was apparently on the payroll. This is a very difficult problem for Brussels to deal with. And as I say, they have a way of working. It's to get through the parliamentary elections next month in June, and then to deal with it. And the fallout from this round of parliamentary elections could be significant. And we still, of course, have Hungary really leading the way. Austria-Hungary, history rhymes, but Hungary has led the way in challenging EU orthodoxy. Should Hungary be sanctioned? Should Hungary have to hold a referendum on whether the population still wants to be part of Europe, considering it's blocking aid to Ukraine and all kinds of other initiatives?
The time is 9:31 here in London. It's 17:31 in Tokyo, which is where we head next now on Monocle on Sunday. I'm delighted to say our editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, is standing by. A very good afternoon to you, Tyler. How's Tokyo looking this afternoon?
Tokyo is looking very nice. You can just feel that this is a city which is moving into summertime. The shorts are out. The shorter skirts are on the street. You've got, of course, all of the big, long caravans. You might be familiar with them, which, of course, are blaring music for the latest, Japanese girl groups. Some things never change here, and the streets are very, very much alive.
What's the cut of a good short in Japan this year? What's the seasonal look?
There's a lot of volume, I have to say. 6 pleats, 8 pleats. That's one direction. That's the boys, anyway. And I can say I've spotted the same on some women as well. There's a lot of volume in general. You'd want to be in the knitwear business in Japan right now, especially t-shirt knits, because the scale and the size, the boxiness is quite remarkable. I was at Isetan a little bit earlier, and there's a whole floor, literally the downstairs the main floor at the men's store has just been devoted to the t-shirt. And it's a celebration of made in Japan. It's a celebration of Japanese cotton. And it is probably 9 to 11 brands you've never heard of who are just trying to sort of outbox each other with just more volume when it comes to doing a tee.
I've never seen you in a wildly voluminous T-shirt, but is there anything you're picking up and putting in the suitcase?
Oh, listen, I had to... I went for it. There was, in part, just for a little bit of research as well, but somehow... As is the case in Tokyo, you get caught up in the moment. So if you see me flapping around when I'm next in London, you'll know it came from Isetan.
I'll just look skyward in case you've taken off. Tell us what news from Japan. We've been talking about conscription here in the studio because the Conservative Party here in the UK want to make it some sort of form of military service compulsory for teens here in the UK. Japan's grappling with a similar problem, isn't it?
Well, Japan is, you could say, like many armed forces around the world, you have, on one side, you look at any of the defense weeklies, any of the defense trade papers, and you see more frigates being ordered. You see more drones, which will require pilots on the ground for them, of course. And of course, more weaponry for ground forces. But someone needs to operate all of this equipment. Someone needs to train the people, of course, that will eventually operate all of this material, and it's an enormous issue. So it's interesting to see, obviously, the moves that Mr. Sunak has made. Don't you recall, though, there was something similar, Emma? I was trying to just think back, but David Cameron, was under his reign as well. There was that moment where he was talking about some type of youth corps as well, and that lasted about, I don't know, was it 3 days, 3 months, but the idea just never happened. Here we have a situation where Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is of course saying, for a variety of reasons, part of it is cohesion, social capital, and also that we know that the Royal Navy, all branches of the British forces, are down on manpower. But of course, that's not the entire part of the story. Yes, it would be probably great if they could up their numbers. But the flip side also seems that this is a bit of a national social project as well.
One wonders what the purpose of the social project is as well, depending on the way that it's being covered. So if you look at the Japan Times and this question about the extension of military conscription, the pictures are of some poor soul on the ground doing terrible sit-ups, clearly not in a happy place. And this is a highly militarised situation. Whereas the British have been talking about doing some sort of community service once a month. And one looks at the sliding scale of what the degree of commitment is, from sort of hardcore military involvement to a spot of litter picking in Surbiton. It's two different stories, isn't it?
Well, it is. And I think we don't have the full picture. I guess we've not seen the full 40-page document yet. It sounds to me like they're going down a bit of a Swiss route. Now, in Switzerland, you can... Of course, you can be part of the civil defense service, and that is where you might be driving grannies around. There was a mobilization actually during COVID. Even some of Monocle's very own staff members who are at Dufourstrasse are part of civil defense. They got called up. They got into their green and orange jumpsuits, and off they went to do their national duties, things that they might have been trained for or not. But these are civil duties, and of course that can be everything from maybe clearing up after an avalanche to indeed being sort of maybe a sexier version of Meals on Wheels. I think that's probably going to be one side. Let's say people who don't want to bear arms will probably go into that branch of the service, and then there's obviously going to be another side where you are going to have to do your assignment and whether trained to be an officer on a minesweeper or at least maybe a more senior cadet on such a vessel. So I think it's going to be sort of this two-track system, which you've seen in many countries. I mean, once upon a time in France was the same thing. If you were maybe on the more clever end of the scale, you were able to join the diplomatic corps. You were able to go off and maybe work for Médecins Sans Frontières, or you would go into the main services. But
let's talk about tourism in Japan. I mean, how busy is it out there? Do they need to have some sort of hospitality conscription as well?
Well, they probably could be mobilizing their forces because, again, you may sort of be missing officers on submarines. It's the same thing at front desk as well, pretty much all over the world. And I was having lunch with one of the hotel groups here today. And yes, it is very difficult finding staff. This is, of course, why Japan is having to open their borders in many ways for part-time workers to clean rooms, to carry bags, to offload bags from aircraft, etc. I mean, it's very interesting. You would never have seen this 10 years ago in Japan when you came into the country. It would have been a Japanese welcome. But now, even if you sort of closed your eyes and just listen to the language, everyone is Filipino yesterday. I would say it was a full, and with these people contracted in as one group, but it was the Filipino sort of brigade who was running immigration at Haneda Airport yesterday.
And how does that change the perception of Japan, given it has such a singular identity to the outside world?
And I think that's something what everyone is sort of grappling with right now is how Japan do you want Japan to be? And I think Japan is riding this wave, partly because, yes, the country has opened up. They've made it easier. You've had, over the last decade and a half, Haneda, which is the airport, which is much closer to the center of Tokyo, is allowing more international flights. So it's easier to, of course, just land in Japan and get up and running. I would say that's one side of it. And so you could say that Japan has sort of created this situation in many ways. But of course, you need people to man this. We know the story about aging society and all of the things that are happening here demographically. And that means they simply need more bodies. And that was a little bit of a conversation that I was having, which is this in a way. When you arrive at a hotel, do you want to be greeted by somebody, I mean, whether they're from China, or whether they're from Korea, or whether they're maybe on a student visa or able to sort of get a job at a major hotel and they're Australian, is that what people's expectations are of this country? And I think maybe Japan more than anywhere else, I think people, they want a certain type of authenticity where, yeah, you could say much of the world now is, of course, very multicultural and maybe in a way much more pronounced that we're supposed to sort of welcome everybody. But that's not quite the situation here. It's almost as a little bit of a double standard, people's expectations of this country.
Something that I know that you wanted to mention, I trailed it at the top of this programme, is the world of allergies. And the fact is now, is everybody sort of chomping down on a gluten-free katsu sando, or is this something that hasn't hit Japan yet?
Well, it's interesting because I think, if you would have been in Japan pre-Olympics, of course, no one was really here for the Olympics, but nevertheless, Japan 5 years ago, no one was ever asking you, Emma-san, do you have any allergies? This never happened. And I think this was something that really it came about in the world of course, in the world of welcoming the world to Japan, that I think they thought if people are coming from all quarters of the planet, then, absolutely we must, make sure that we're doing what would happen at a dinner party, or if I was at a restaurant in Los Angeles or London, I would be asking people about their dietary requirements. So I've always found it a little bit clunky. But here's the thing: last week we did 2 events on the Iberian Peninsula. We had quite a big evening in Madrid, and then we did something quite similar in Lisbon as well. And it was mostly Portuguese men and women in Lisbon, and then of course a lovely sort of crowd of Madrileños in Madrid. The concept, the idea, everyone ate everything. And this was a very sort of broad mix of people. And it just made me think this would not have happened had we been in Toronto or London or Sydney or anywhere else. You just would not have seen any, no one asking. There was nothing sort of, discussed in advance. Just people sort of dove in. And if you didn't like something, well, maybe you didn't eat it. But it didn't become a process. It wasn't a process for the hosts, and it wasn't a process for the people running the restaurant. And so I'm sort of the view that maybe, and I think actually it was interesting, this was interesting over lunch. I think Japan was sort of saying, is it a Western thing? I'm like, actually, no, it's not a Western thing. Don't blame the Portuguese. Don't lump in the Spaniards. Probably don't lump in the French either. This is very much something which is probably concocted by the English-speaking world. And
can we lump it? So we can't, therefore, as a result, lump in the Swiss as well, whose effective diet is kind of gluten and dairy and pork.
Well, no, I mean, I think that there's probably many other places. I think on the Swiss side, the country is so, there's so many expats. So you have so many Brits, Americans, who are part of not just the banking community, but I think that they've brought this habit with them as well. So, and again, this was the conversation saying, if you're going to be Japan, actually maybe is it right for people when we say we want to be inclusive? Well, in Japan, they've got their diet. This is how they eat. So trying to impose our values on the Japanese, does that really make sense? I don't think so.
Tyler in Tokyo, thank you so much for joining us on the line. The time is 9:43 here in London. You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. We spin round now to Nairobi, where it's 11:43 a.m. in Kampala. We can hear from Naveena Kottoor. A very good morning to you, Naveena. How goes it where you are?
Good morning, Emma. It's nice to hear from you. We talk about the weather quite regularly, the two of us. It's quite a beautiful day here, but we've had very heavy rain again the last couple of days, so that's making a few things quite difficult, but the sun is shining, at least for now.
Indeed. So this is a picture in Nairobi, and we're all sort of always wondering about the kind of the wider prospect, because in the last couple of weeks we've had some pretty terrible flooding happening in Kenya, haven't we?
Yes, there were very severe floods, actually, also in the capital. The government has announced that basically ordered for informal settlements along the rivers to be destroyed. I witnessed some of that. It was quite dramatic, I have to say, and people were quite frustrated that the government didn't offer an alternative to this kind of housing that they were using. We are now expecting more rain from June to September. That's what was announced this week by a regional body that's been monitoring the weather. So we're kind of bracing ourselves for another 3 months of rain.
Right, let us bring us, well, I'll hand you an umbrella. We have quite a few in the United Kingdom, although none of them went near our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on last week. Let's talk about Kenya and the fact that the President, William Ruto, has been the first African president in 16 years to be hosted, to be invited to a state dinner at the White House. I mean, that is a long time.
Yes, it is a long time, and I think it underlines the importance Kenya plays for U.S. foreign policy on the continent. It was, I think, from a Kenyan perspective, a huge win. Ruto is coming back with a substantive investment commitment by Microsoft. The company announced they're going to invest $1 billion in Kenya. Coca-Cola wants to expand its investment here. They are also going to chip in some money. And Kenya's relationship with the US was upgraded as Kenya is now a major non-NATO ally. It's a largely symbolic announcement, this non-NATO ally membership or status, but I think it's a significant move by the US to show that it recognizes that Kenya has been loyal to the United States and to the West. Kenya has committed to sending forces to Haiti and has been backing the Ukraine in the conflict with Russia, unlike many other African countries. So it's quite a big week for President Ruto.
And indeed, it's a big week for the United States in the way that it is seen by the outside world in terms of its relationship with Africa. I mean, you talked about the complications when it comes to Russia's involvement in various states. But also for such a long time, the United States has said we need to compete with China in terms of its influence on the continent. I mean, where does Kenya fit with that?
I think Kenya has firmly sided with not just the United States, but with the UK, with the European Union. It's not playing neutral. There are other countries, as you know, Uganda, Ethiopia, South Africa, that are not committing to basically an alliance with the West, that are playing neutral and forming alliances, not just with China and Russia, but also with countries in the Gulf like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar. And Kenya in all of this has been very, very pro-Western, and it's being rewarded for that.
Let's move on to another story that's happening, a huge story. And we've been talking all year about the number of countries going to the polls. South Africa votes on Wednesday. This is an enormous event for the whole continent, isn't it?
Yes, it is an enormous event for the whole continent and also for South Africa. South Africa is the most developed country on the continent. It is a major political player, not just in Africa, but outside as well. Everyone is watching what is going to happen. It looks like the ANC has not been able to recover some of the votes that it was hoping to recover. Election campaigning ended yesterday, and it looks like approval ratings for the ANC remain at a record low. And it looks like we are heading into a coalition government, which is something new for the country. And we'll have to see how the ANC, but also how the smaller parties will handle this.
Because the main reports that are coming out of South Africa is that the ANC share of the vote could fall to as low as 40%, which would force it into a coalition. And it could absolutely upset the South African political status quo that's been, the ANC have been around for decades.
Yes, the ANC has been in power for the last 30 years. It has been running the country for that time. And many voters are now accusing the ANC of mismanaging this economy, of basically being a corrupt party, of cronyism, and the ANC is likely to suffer in the election. There are people who are a bit more bullish about the prospects of the South African economy in the coming years. They argue that major reforms have actually been silently brought underway, that the electricity crisis is probably likely to take a turn this year. So that might help the ANC in the coming months. But I think we're looking at a few months of negotiations and wrangling in Pretoria.
And who could we see the ANC going into coalition with?
The Democratic Alliance is at the moment the second largest party in the polls, and is predicted to win around 18.6% of the vote. So I think it is likely that the ANC will start talks with them. It's very, very unlikely that there'll be enough of a majority that the ANC can form with other parties. But as you said, it's unprecedented, this election result that we're expecting. So I think we just have to wait and see and watch the results.
Naveena, stay with us, because in the studio I have Tina and Stephen. Stephen, you wanted to talk about the South African elections this weekend, didn't you?
Yes, I just I think it's a terribly sad story, actually. As someone who remembers that moment when Mandela walked free from jail, and the way in which it was handled, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it just seemed in the 90s that there was real hope for change, for a better South Africa, for a fairer South Africa. And yet, from what I'm reading, and I have to stress it's what I've read rather than my own personal experience, it's gone into not only a dead end, but it's become so corrupt that those who thought that their lives were going to get better when Mandela was freed, their children now are saying, but nothing's happened. We're still as badly off, and crime is rife, and corruption is rife, and what have we got to look forward to? Which sounds very sad.
Tina?
Well, South Africa was such an inspiring story, as Stephen says, and I remember it too. But the moral authority of the ANC has declined. 30 years is a long time to hold power and to not return very much to the people. And not only that, to preside over such disintegration, including the delivery of basic services. I mean, I employ a couple of people based in South Africa, so I hear their stories. They're younger people in their 20s and 30s. There's not a lot of optimism, and yet South Africa is a rich country, and it should be performing much better than it does.
Naveena, listening to those two views, is there any space for optimism or indeed hope when it comes to this week's elections?
I think, we have to see, but I think the country ultimately can't really afford to go on as it has been in the last couple of years. It has been... Its economic ratings have been dragged down by the issues around corruption, cronyism. But it looks like some major reforms in the transport sector and the electricity sector have been brought underway. That certain things are likely to kind of open up, and that might ease the political transition.
Now, tell us about lions. This is a problem where you are, isn't it?
Yes, it is. There was a lot of talk here, not just in the newspapers, but also on WhatsApp, as you can imagine, about reports that 3 lions seem to have left Nairobi National Park, the park that is adjacent to the capital, and are roaming around in the neighborhoods that are next to the park. I think initially it was dismissed by the Kenyan Wildlife Service. Then it issued a warning asking people to be careful and be in touch in case they see these lions. And now it seems that on Tuesday, a lioness climbed into a gated wall, surveyed the home, and attacked a dog and carried the dog out by the neck, having clearly killed it beforehand. This whole incident was caught on CCTV, and the woman who owns the dog said it took about 10 minutes for the lion to come and kill the dog. So I wouldn't say everyone is a bit on edge, but it is something that keeps everyone busy.
Yes, I imagine that quite a few people might be on edge, given to what you've just said. But when you sort of talk about the wildlife sanctuary that's on the outskirts of Nairobi, I mean, how close is this park to Nairobi's sort of city centre? I mean, one's asking, how long a commute of the lions got?
I mean, depending on where they exited from, it is very close to residential and commercial parts of the city. I mean, in fact, it is the only national park in the world that belongs to a capital. It is within the capital boundaries. So depending on where you are in the park, you can see the skyline. The park is largely fenced, but there are areas that are open to allow animals to migrate. I'm not entirely sure when they made the decision they had lions in mind, but it is not entirely fenced.
I think migration is a rather loose term for escaping. What are they going to try and do? Because how do you catch 3 lions?
Well, that is a really good question. The Kenya Wildlife Service did, I think, patrol the area and try to find these lions, but lions tend to hide and sleep during the day. So it's not that easy to find them, even when you are in a national park or in a game reserve. So from what I understand, the Wildlife Service is again back in the area trying to find these lions. But maybe they've just gone back into the park. I don't know.
Naveena, we shall find out more, and we hope to hear from you again. Don't get carried off by a lion. That was Naveena Kottoor in Nairobi. Thank you so much for joining us on Monocle on Sunday. That's an astonishing story. I think there was a story last year about a lion that escaped from the circus and was pottering around an Italian city. But to have 3 lions escape from the local national reserve is really quite something. And not much fun for the dog.
Yeah, no, not really. Well, of course, we have a serious problem in North London with foxes.
Foxes, yes.
which surprises people.
They're a bit smaller than lions,
They're a bit
Stephen.
smaller than lions, and they do tend to actually they don't tend to run away when you sort of go out to say, "Oi, get off my," don't just go pooing in my garden. They'll look at you and they turn around and they sort of potter off, and if you start running, then they might go a bit faster.
Yeah, I mean, I would say they're even more brazen.
They're brazen, but I
think they own the place.
They do.
They think they do.
They
But,
do.
But no, not mocking the fact that, actually, if you've got a lion in your garden and it's killing your dog, and that's it must be pretty terrifying, actually.
Shut the door.
I think lions are magnificent beasts. And I've been pretty close to them, but only in a safari park here in Britain, in Longleat. One of them actually stood right in front of my car once, which means we couldn't go any further. It was a lion, a male, and then it yawned. And how big its jaws are is just frightening. And then the lioness came pottering around. It was only when she started to bite the car that the wardens actually told them to go away, and we were able to carry on. But I've been that close to lions. The lioness pressed her face up against the window too, which frightened my then small children. But they are impressive beasts. Gosh,
A lion bit my car.
yes.
I think we should be afraid of wild animals, by the way. We're in their territory. I think it's quite a normal response.
I love that. We're in W1, possibly the most central part of London.
Yes.
We should be afraid of the wild animals. We've got about a minute left. Anything that you want to talk about for the rest of the programme?
I want to talk about how Trump was booed yesterday at the Libertarian Conference.
Go on.
Because I want to counteract what I see as a narrative that's taken hold too fast in the UK and Europe and elsewhere, frankly, that Trump is inevitably going to be re-elected. He is not a shoo-in for this. Now, Libertarians, the US political party, only represent around 3% of the vote, but Trump had thought that he could woo them, and he was roundly booed yesterday. So I just want to pass on that he hasn't got their vote.
What did he do wrong for them to get himself booed? He doesn't really care, I would
Just be
imagine.
Trump, probably. Yeah.
The interesting thing that I think is not appreciated is that Trump is actually quite interventionist and believes in the power of state in many ways, in the same way that fascists of yore did, which is for the benefit of natives. So they're not really, I mean, Trump is in no way a Ronald Reagan kind of small government, low interventionist. He's just anti-benefits for non-natives.
Or whether he considers the state to be a company. One wonders whether actually he's not talking about the state as an entity in itself, but just another branch of the empire.
Of the Trump empire.
And that begs the question very, very quickly. The fact is it Trump who's stealing the headlines, or is it Biden who's failing to?
Probably the former, but again, to go back to the Washington Post, what I find very interesting is that obviously they're bashing Trump, but they're also warning people, don't think you can't go out and vote. Go and vote, because otherwise you might get Trump.
Thank you very much indeed for that. And the warmest of thanks to all my guests today. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Stephen. And Naveena Kottoor and Tyler Brûlé joining me in the studio. Thanks too to our producer, Mariella Bevan, and our studio engineer, Tamsin Howard. I'm Emma Nelson. Monocle on Sunday is back at the same time next week. But until then, enjoy the rest of your weekend and watch out for the lions.